Good morning. Welcome to our Sunday Forum today. I'm Rebecca Miller. I'm part of the Sunday Forum Committee. And our forums are opportunities for conversations about faith and life. We seek to provide a thoughtful and welcoming learning environment for members and friends of Plymouth Congregational Church. So thank you for joining us in the chapel, and those of you that are remote. If you're on Zoom and if you have a question, please type your questions in the Q&A, as well as any tech support needs. You can also click on a raised hand and you'll be unmuted. And feel free to use the chat if you'd like to converse with someone remotely. Thanks to Alex Johnson for his assistance with our audiovisual needs, our technical needs today. And our guest this morning is Dr. Yelena Bailey. She's a writer, researcher, and former professor of English and Cultural Studies. She enjoys writing about race, power, policy, and culture. She's currently the Director of Education Policy at the State of Minnesota's Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Bureau. So please welcome Yelena.
Thank you so much. Take this off for a little bit. Can you hear me okay? Okay, perfect. I am very excited to be here with you. I'm going to share my screen so I don't forget to do that. This is the first talk I've been able to give in person, actually. So over the past year or so, I've given. Is it not on? How's that? Okay. I tend to want to go like this, so I'll try to look a little bit closer to the mic. Yeah, so this is the first time I've been able to give a talk in person, which is great. The last year or so, I've been all virtual, which is kind of nice because I can sit in my dining room while my dog runs around, but it's nice to also be in a room with people, so thank you for having me here. I'm gonna spend the time, I'm gonna try to keep really good on time here to leave for questions. Talking a bit about my book and some of the topics in it, which is called How the Streets Were Made, Housing Segregation and Black Life in America. Hopefully it's right on par with some of the many topics I've been hearing you've been discussing in your forums. It sounds like you dig into a lot of issues. So hopefully you find this interesting. I always, when I give these talks, wonder, because I, of course, geek out and love this history and these things, and I think, are people really that interested? Because I'm going to go into this history of housing segregation. But hopefully you find it engaging, enlightening, and something that can help inform your community conversations. So if at any time the sound is not well, tell me. Might have to, you know what, why don't I go like this? I'm going to lean back. Is that okay? All right, I'll try that. So what I like to do is, and I won't make you share anything, but virtually I would have people close their eyes and think about this. You could just think it with your eyes open. I used to hate, I was sharing with them, I'm Episcopalian and we do very strong liturgy, but I used to hate in church when people would be like, talk to your neighbor, close your eyes. I was never that person, so I won't make you do this. But I like to have people start by just thinking through what are the kind of gut reaction images and words and ideas, sounds that come to mind when I say a few phrases. Again, you're not going to share any of these. And not what you think should come to mind or what you challenge yourself not to think about, but just that gut reaction, what comes to mind. So the first one is the hood, the ghetto, North Minneapolis, Southside Chicago, the streets. So hopefully you've gathered a few images, sounds, ideas. I start with this because, you know, we've obviously challenged ourselves to think differently about a lot of things, but we as people are socialized or conditioned to make certain associations with spaces and people and things, right? That's the kind of crux of my background in cultural studies. And that's really what my book is about. So I wanted to dig into why is it when someone says South Side of Chicago, people get a certain idea, right? They're gonna imagine certain people, right? You're likely to visualize Black Americans. You might think of churches, you might think of gun violence, you might think of hip hop, you might think of cars, you might think of a lot of different things. But that's not because you have conjured this in your mind on your own, but because through media, through history, through popular culture, marketing campaigns, which I'll talk a little bit about, we have created this idea associated with spaces. And so that's really what I mean when I talk about the streets, which is another way of saying the hood or the ghetto, is that it's not just a physical space of, let's say, North Minneapolis, but it's all the associations and the meanings and the ideas that go along with that space and the people that live there. So this is something that's really close to my heart. This book that I wrote, this project, is something I'd been thinking about for maybe 10 years, I would say, in kind of a professional way, but I think in many ways something I thought about my whole life. So I was just sharing here that I grew up in the Twin Cities, although I left almost immediately when I became an adult to go live on the West Coast, but I'm back now. But I grew up in the Northwest suburbs. And my life, I like to explain to people, and I talk about this briefly in the introduction, was shaped by the streets, but not because I lived there. And they were shaped by them because my mom grew up in the projects of North Minneapolis. And she would share a lot of stories with me about how the rare times she would see the police there was when there was like chasing someone through the neighborhood, and just some of the difficulties and things she went through. Her mom eventually married a veteran, and they were able to move to Brooklyn Park. And that was a big deal to get out of there. But she wanted me to have access to educational opportunities and things that she didn't have growing up. And so for her, that meant going to the first ring suburbs so I could get the education that middle class, white Americans had. But to do that, to afford those apartments, we moved basically every year from apartment to apartment just so we could find a place to afford to live and to not be forced back into the affordable area of North Minneapolis. And so that's something I really thought about, is how I lived a life shaped by this idea of the streets, the opportunities available to me, even though I didn't actually grow up physically in that space. And so that was something I really began to think about. Well, how did we get here? How does this become this? Sorry if there's feedback. That was me. How did we get to this idea of Black space being an entity that shapes not just your daily life, but your opportunities, your outcomes, all these other things? So that's one thing that really interested me. Also, growing up here in the Twin Cities, I love Minneapolis, St. Paul area for many, many reasons. We have great parks. It is affordable, especially after living on the West Coast. I moved back here because I figured if I was ever going to own a home, this is the only place that's going to happen. But we're also voted consistently over several years the second worst metro area for Black people to live in. And that's down almost entirely to this history of housing segregation and how it plays into the racial wealth gap. And so that's something, again, personally, I just wanted to dig into. And because I had the means as a scholar and as a person who had these experiences, that's what led me to do this work. And so I'm going to walk through some of those ideas with you today, some of the history. Hopefully you find it exciting and not too boring. And then I want to talk a little bit more broadly about the idea of homeownership itself and how that became really central to how we understand ourselves in this country, who belongs, who doesn't belong, and how that spills over into other arenas. So I'm just going to talk at the end today about how I see that in marketing campaigns. In the book, I talk about television and film. Maybe some of you, when I mentioned those phrases earlier, you thought of TV shows like The Wire. That's probably the biggest one. I talk a little bit about, obviously, music and hip hop and things like that, but I'm not going to get into all that today. I'm just going to give you some history and then talk a little bit about marketing, because that's my favorite chapter. So I will get to this. Or maybe I won't turn. That's all right. I'll turn it in a second. Hopefully I'm still muted. It doesn't look like on there. So the history of housing segregation, has anybody read or familiar with Richard Rothstein had a book that came out a couple years ago called The Color of Law. It's a really good history of it. And then there's Keeanga Yamada Taylor's published The Race for Profit. There's been some really good books that talk kind of about this history. And I want to go over a little bit of that now. Or there's a really good PBS special. I don't know if you're familiar with that, The House We Live In. Came out maybe 25 years ago, but PBS, it's still really solid every time I go back and watch it. A PBS special, The House We Live In. It's really great. I'm biased because I really love PBS, but it, even now, still solid. Everything I said is very true. So you maybe are familiar with some of this, but a lot of people start talking about housing segregation. You think of redlining, which I'll talk a little bit about, and you visualize maps like this. But for me and my kind of work, it's really important to contextualize and look at not just, okay, here's the policy that created these, physically separated spaces, but how did we get there and what were the social and cultural forces that led to that? So you have to take a step back and really look at the turn of the 20th century, because you don't get to these maps without thinking about the Great Migration. So the Great Migration is when you had millions of Black Americans migrating up from the South to northern cities. And they're fleeing for very concrete reasons, right? So this is not long after people like Ida B. Wells had published the Red Record, and they're talking about these mass lynchings across the South. You had the Black codes that are created that criminalize things like walking next to a railroad or being caught at any moment without a job. So people are fearing real physical danger. So they flee up north because it's a place of more opportunity. And for many reasons that had been true. So you think of kind of famous figures like W.E.B. Du Bois or Charles Chestnut, who lived in the North, kind of part of the Black middle class. And up until the early 20th century, the 1910s, Black Americans were actually tolerated fairly well in those cities. Not socially integrated, but they lived in integrated neighborhoods and were able to do well for themselves. And a lot of researchers have found that really what they take that down to is there was kind of a percentage tipping point. So up until you had a certain percentage of Black people moving into neighborhoods, it was okay. But when you get millions of people migrating to cities like Minneapolis, Chicago, New York, that changes things. And the first really beginnings of housing segregation are on these very local levels, right? So you have people, there's a story that Richard Rothstein tells, and I talk about in my book, in neighborhoods, just banding together to do things like rent a house next to a Black family. And they created basically like this white supremacist clubhouse where they would blast music and they would say, derogatory things and throw things across the fence at them. You have physical things like in Chicago, a new Black neighborhood was bombed, right? But eventually, these kind of local reactions start to form themselves into policies. So you start with city ordinances that ban the integration of neighborhoods. And of course, famously, if I can get this to turn for us, let's see. You get these local covenants. So my best friend lives in Longfellow, and when she bought her house, she showed me this part that was in her deed, and she's like, I know you're gonna be interested in this because of your book. And I said, can I use this whenever I give a talk? So this is in her deed. I blacked out her name, that's what that is. She said, just don't tell people my address or my name. But you have these covenants that put provisions that say, this house cannot be sold to anyone that is Black or anyone who marries or lives with someone who is Black. Later covenants take on and they'll add, variations that include Jewish folks, Asian people, other races as well. But this is kind of the most well-known example of the local policies that start to enforce this segregation. Eventually, the Supreme Court makes this explicit way of doing it illegal, but neighborhoods get around it because they can then add neighborhood covenants that say, okay, well, if you're going to sell a house to someone that will change the racial composition of the neighborhood, then the neighborhood association has to vote on it so that they approve that. So they do this under the guise of kind of like, democratic will of the people to say that that's what makes it fair. And that passes legally. That is allowed to continue. So that's what starts to happen on these local levels. And then you have larger on citywide levels in places like Atlanta. City planners then begin to incorporate this idea of segregating space into their actual city planning. So as they were designing the expansion of the city, they designate this as the Black neighborhood and this is the white neighborhood and some of the other somewhat integrated neighborhoods. One side fact is that a lot of these policies actually ended up integrating neighborhoods that were kind of working class. So a lot of times folks lived close to factories and they were integrated neighborhoods that had this kind of class solidarity, but these policies essentially disrupted those. So this is what starts to build, and this is all happening in the 1910s and the 1920s. I think that I like to start with this history so that when I get to the map on the next page, you realize that when you have the creation of Hulk, which I'll talk about, and the Federal Housing Administration, the New Deal, that really all that is just a federal kind of systematizing of the local and state will of the people, right? So it's something that had been happening for a good 20, 30 years already, and it just gets kind of made concrete by the federal government. I think that's helpful because when people often just look at those maps and they see, well, the federal government created the FHA and that's where we got redlining, it seems very top down instead of something that is, unfortunately, something that progressed naturally according to what people's desires were at the time. And I think that's important because it really leads us back to our beliefs and our ideologies about one another and how that shapes policy. As you mentioned, I'm in policy work right now. I'm in education policy, and I think about this a lot with the work that we're doing and the conversations around critical race theory, which our agency had an article published on us about that, but happy to talk about that later. So this all leads up to kind of the famous notion people think of redlining, right? So this map is from Hulk, which is a homeowners loan corporation. And they were actually the first ones to do redlining. So this is all part of that New Deal. And if you're unfamiliar, before the 1930s, if you wanted to buy a home, you had to have a lot of money. Seems familiar now. But you had very short mortgage terms, right? You had to pay off your mortgage in 3 to 5 years. You had to put 50% down. It was a very limited group of people who could afford homes. The New Deal was amazing in many ways because it allowed folks to do the terms we're more familiar with now, right? 5 to 20% down, 30-year mortgage. And because the federal government underwrote these and reshaped the nature and the terms of the loan, people could build equity right away. So things that are, no-brainers to us now were in many ways, I think, a radical transformation of homeownership and the way that it was able to build wealth. And so I think that that's important to know. Hulk was created, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, for those folks who already had mortgages, and it just refinanced their mortgage to give them those good terms, right? What they did is to secure these loans, because again, the federal government is underwriting them, is they contracted out with local appraisers to go to these different cities to evaluate the neighborhoods and to figure out what the economic risk was associated with these loans. So this is where you get these maps, right? So evaluating the risk, the green areas, and I know maybe you can't see it quite as well, there's not a lot of green on this map of Minneapolis, you'll notice, first of all. This tiny sliver right over here, I'm gonna point it out. The tip of Longfellow right there is actually where that deed is from. So it's just a fun fact, that tiny, tiny sliver there. And then you have this gradient down all the way to the red areas that were obviously the Black neighborhoods. But what's important, I think, to also notice is the in-between shades. So it's not just that Black neighborhoods were deemed the most economically risky, all white neighborhoods were the most, financially, or the least risky, I should say, but it's that the proximity to Blackness itself becomes a source of financial risk, right? So a famous example that people maybe are familiar with is the Detroit 8 Mile Wall, where that neighborhood wanted to increase the value of their homes, but they were too close to a Black neighborhood, so they built that wall to separate, and it did indeed increase, when they were reappraised, their value of their homes, right? I point this out because this is a really good example of how policy then becomes ingrained, not just in, the law, but the way we create our kind of cultural common sense. Because in 1968, this is outlawed. You can't explicitly do this kind of stuff. But the damage is done because the association between race and economic risk is already established. And then we made that a manifest reality because the white neighborhoods that were the least risky had higher home values, higher bases for, taxes for schools, that over the decades that wealth increased. So then it becomes a manifested reality that, yeah, of course, the white neighborhoods are least risky and the Black neighborhoods are the most risky. So then without having to explicitly say or mention race, that practice still continues, right? A really good example in the news, I think it's probably about 10 years ago now, if you remember, Wells Fargo was in the news for what they called their ghetto loans, right? So they created these horrible terms, mortgage terms for Black lenders, but they could justify it legally because that association of race and economic risk had already long been established. And this is something I think is important, hopefully, for conversations and your own life, and maybe your politics, your voting, your practices, is to think through what we have, the work we have yet to do to rectify these pieces, right? So we've changed the law, but we haven't quite changed these. And a good example of that, I know this is really hard to see, so I'll give you the highlight. This is from the DOT project, and it used to be on mapping inequality, but I think their data expired, so I'm not sure if it's still online. It's a really cool project. But if you remember in 2010, someone took the census data and they put a dot for each racial code so that you could visualize neighborhoods. And I love this of the Twin Cities because it gives a really good stark contrast of how segregated the Twin Cities metro continues to be. I'm going to switch back for 1 second. If you look at this, again, the red neighborhoods, you'll notice North Minneapolis, which again, I asked you to think about the associations there and the very real realities of some of the violence and issues there, stemming back to a lot of these policies created. If you look, well, this was 12 years ago, but even to today, it remains that same segregation in those areas. One kind of side fascinating thing is that really the only significant change is we have more migration of Latinx and Asian folks, and you can see some of that mapping there. But again, still the highly segregated areas, particularly in St. Paul with some of our Southeast Asian populations. But I am digressing a little bit because I find all of this super fascinating. I told you I would geek out a little bit about it. Let's see. Oh, I'll wait. I'm going to talk to you about that in a second. So I've hopefully given you enough context of some of the history itself and how we got there. But really what interests me is, again, what's the legacy, right? So as you've created these new mortgage terms, and again, the New Deal was amazing, right? It made homeownership widely accessible, although less than 2% of those loans went to Black Americans. So it was widely accessible to white Americans, right? We created brand new suburban enclaves. In a lot of ways, you had white ethnic groups being merged together for the first time. So a lot of Southeastern Europeans and Jewish folks were able to move into kind of this modern American form of white suburban, homeownership. And I'll talk a little bit about how there were new markets created around that for kind of consumerism, but a whole identity is shaped out of that. And then what happens in the cities is you have Black people confined to these spaces where their public housing, which I'm not going to talk about, but if you have questions, happy to get into it. It shifts, unsurprisingly, at the moment where public housing is now widely accessible to Black Americans in that mid-20th century and more used by them, you go from single-family homes to tall high-rises that are dense in the city. You have new zoning that happens that permits more industrialization in those Black spaces. You have the more permits that are granted for bars, less policing of brothels. And again, none of this was with the idea of, let's reduce kind of policing of people's behavior, but it was a move to allow what was deemed morally deficient or inferior behavior in those Black spaces. So what you shape then is that the suburbs become the site of, kind of wholesome white American family life, and the city becomes a site of Blackness and of moral deficiency, right? So it's not just that you've created this vast racial wealth gap, which people still underestimate. There was a Stanford psychological study that surveyed white Americans, and they asked, well, how much do you think, what do you think the gap is? And the average person thought Black Americans had 80% of the wealth of white Americans, and the reality is closer to 5%. And that's, if you've paid attention to the news lately, getting, worse right now with the difficulties with homeownership, the increasing rent prices, even here in the Twin Cities. So we have these kind of solid economical realities that are the clear legacy of this, but also the cultural understandings of how we associate space and the values that we associate with these spaces and the people who inhabit them. So that's really what I hope kind of your main takeaway is from that history portion. What I want to do now, and I am being cognizant of the time, is I want to talk a little bit about this idea of homeownership and how it really is central to our understanding of who belongs in this country and how they belong. So I'm going to step back again to the beginning of the 20th century. And I'll put this up so you can look at it as I talk. So what happens is before you get to the Federal Housing Administration and those new terms that make homeownership possible, we actually have a decades-long project led by a lot of our political leaders in this country to make homeownership desirable and is an essential part of demonstrating your kind of patriotism and belonging here. So a good example of this is Hoover, which I'll read a snippet of a speech from him, begins in the early 20th century with the Better Homes in America movement, and they would put ads in different magazines talking about the value of homeownership, usually aimed at white women homemakers, actually. And a part of that movement was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was at the time the president of the American Construction Council. So there's a lot of interplay between private and public going on there. Then Vice President Calvin Coolidge. So a lot of these people who are leaders politically are also invested in making homeownership something that people widely, people I'm using in a broad term, but we'll look at what kind of people, are invested in emotionally, right? My favorite example of what's happening in the early 20th century is the Own Your Own Home campaign. So this is something that was actually founded by the National Association of Realtors, I always get their acronym off, who, interestingly enough, put in their code of ethics that it was unethical to sell a house to someone who would change the racial composition of a neighborhood. So they found what is called the Own Your Own Home campaign. But then in 1917, the Department of Labor takes this over. And so it becomes then a public or a government movement. Don't know if 1917 rings in your mind at all, but what happens is the Bolshevik Revolution. So all of a sudden, communism is scary, and we have to make sure people are invested in the nation. And what better way to be invested than to own your own piece of the nation in your home? So the Department of Labor takes this on, and they have a series of posters that they put up everywhere from factories to offices, so attempting to reach across class. They would hand out buttons to kids at schools. They would publish things like this in magazines aimed at, housewives. So it was this massive campaign to really show, if you want to be a good American, you want to own your own home, right? And so hopefully as you're thinking, I'm trying to draw a parallel here that at the same time you have this mass migration of Black, migrants from the South and all these things happening, you have this push by the government to say home ownership is really important. And it comes together in that 1934 moment when the New Deal then says, we've told you home ownership is important, now it's possible. And then you have all the things that kind of go from there. So this ad is one of my favorites from the Own Your Own Home campaign. And you can see how it says the man who owns his own home is a better worker, husband, father, citizen, and a real American, emphasizing the real American bit. You probably can't see this part that well, but it's usually accompanied by some paragraphs that really talk about how it's a financially wise decision, how it makes for better family life. So it's really selling the idea of homeownership as good personally and economically, but also as a way to demonstrate your investment and your belonging in the country. You'll notice that these ads are very centralized around the kind of white nuclear family. So when we think today, people say, what's the American dream? The house with the white picket fence and the 2.5 kids, or people are at least familiar with that narrative. This is where that actually comes from, right? It wasn't just something that popped up, but it was something that was really generated strategically through these campaigns, right? These images we have of home life comes from this government activity, which to me I find wildly fascinating. So this is another one aimed at the white women homemakers, right? So where she talks about how glad she agreed about buying their own home. And then in it, it talks a little bit again about how it's financially responsible, but about this one and others will talk about how it's good for the kids and family life, and how you can create a space that is your own. It's warm, it's welcoming, it's inviting. So it's kind of this attempt to draw people in sentimentally as well. I'm going to read you an excerpt from a speech that Herbert Hoover gave in 1931 to the address, the White House Conference on Home Building and Homeownership. that hopefully really hits home how this was a major kind of project, cultural movement, a project to make homeownership central to American identity in the 20th century, and I would argue today as well. So he goes, I am confident that the sentiment for homeownership is so embedded in the American heart that millions of people who dwell in tenements, apartments, and rented rows of solid brick have the aspiration for wider opportunity and ownership of their homes. To possess one's own home is the hope and ambition of almost every individual in our country. Impelled by the high ideal and aspiration that each family may pass their days in the home which they own, that they may nurture it as theirs, that it may be their castle and all that exquisite sentiment which it surrounds the sweetness of family life. This aspiration penetrates the heart of our national well-being. It makes for happier married life. It makes for better children. It makes for confidence and security. It makes for courage to meet the battle of life. It makes for better citizenship. There can be no fear for a democracy, for self-government, or for liberty or freedom from homeowners, no matter how humble they may be. So as you hear this, you can see, hopefully now given this context, how much it's shaped by this idea that people want to be invested in the American project by owning their own home, right? There's no fear for democracy from people who own their own home. And that it's tied to this idea of family life and national well-being. That phrase becomes important because Hoover and others actually designed these zoning manuals, and this language of national and economic well-being becomes something that's used to reinforce that segregation. So as they're telling people, own your own homes, this is good for national well-being, they also reinforce the idea that we have to keep the races separated because that's good for national and economic well-being as well. So you can't really disentangle this idea that homeownership, and particularly white, kind of heteronuclear homeownership, is central to who belongs in this nation. This is the picture of who, Americans are. So for me, I then began to wonder, well, obviously, I see that Black Americans are absent from this. So how does that play out then? Where do they show up? And this translates over into kind of marketing and other arenas in popular culture and film, television. So in the rest of my book, I kind of look at, well, if you're absent from this picture of the ideal American and belonging, where then do you show up and what kind of narratives does that create? So I'll spend a little bit of time on that. I will just briefly mention, because it's one of my favorite bits of history, that this carries on into the Cold War. If you've heard has anybody heard of the kitchen debate? No? Oh, it's a fantastic piece of history. I think you can watch snippets from it on YouTube, but then Vice President Nixon with Khrushchev, we had this exchange with them, a cultural exchange. So the US had an exhibit in Moscow, and then the USSR had an exhibit here in the US. And the US's exhibit of here's what makes America and capitalism great was a model home that you could buy using these loans in these suburbs. And it's called the kitchen debate because, as you can see, Nixon showing Khrushchev, he actually walks him through and shows, here's the appliances that come with it. Someone can buy it, an average worker can buy it for this amount. And then he actually goes on to talk about, we make life easy for our women and our housewives. This is like the actual words he's saying. And this is what makes American capitalism great, right? So the idea of homeownership and that space and that domestic life within it becomes central to not just our identity within the country, but how we project ourselves out into the world and try to battle against, the threat of communism. The exchange is hilarious. If you've ever heard Khrushchev talk, because he talks a lot, if you're interested in history, it's a fun bit to look up. So the last thing I want to just share with you, and hopefully I'll end in maybe about 5 minutes to give you some time for questions, is what I kind of look at in my second chapter, which is my kind of favorite bit, is then looking at how all of these ideas and what becomes the cultural common sense around homeownership shapes things like marketing. So there's a really good book, I think called Soap, Sex, and Cigarettes, that talks about the market that's created around homeownership. So, this is a multi-million-dollar industry after you have these loans and the creation of these suburb enclaves. Tide heavy duty detergent did not exist before then. It was created specifically for this. You have the marketing of new appliances and things like that. And then you have the proliferation of ads like this in magazines like Life that depict, again, that happy domestic life, right? This is an advertisement for, let's see, it's some sort of appliance, a refrigerator. You'll notice the absent father because he's a good provider and a real American, so he's out providing. And then you have the children working on their education, the housewife there. It's the happy domestic life that Hoover's talking about, right? Some 30 years prior. I think I have one more I'll show you. A similar ad, right? Again, the happy domestic life with the kids, the housewife, and the absent provider. I show you this because what happens then for Black Americans is largely through most of the not even most, before the 20th century, but up until the mid 20th century, less than 1% of advertisements focus on Black people as consumers. So they're just not even on the radar. That changes with John Johnson, who is the founder of Ebony Magazine. He founds Jet and a bunch of other magazines. But I can't overstate this kind of cultural and historical significance of what he did. So he founds Ebony to be what he considers, or he wants to be, the Black counterpart of Life magazine, right? So he creates it, he wants it to focus on the happier life, happier side of what he called Negro life. There's, stories about Black doctors and lawyers and travel and things like that. Over time, you also get more articles and essays on issues like housing discrimination and issues of race. So it's like digging into really deep stuff. But at the same time, Ebony is really a magazine that is about advertisements. So he goes and he's sending letters to businesses. He's going and knocking on doors. I mean, he's doing the legwork to get white business owners to invest and to advertise in Ebony Magazine. And he's wildly successful. I think I have one fact that is helpful to give you a sense. Between 1962 and 1969, he increases their ad revenue from $3.6 million to $10 million, right? And this is someone who just decided off the ground, I'm going to start this and get people to pay attention to Black people as consumers. He also works with the Department of Commerce to release a kind of a PSA film called The Secret of Selling the Negro, which actually is aimed at white. It's also on YouTube, and it's hilarious if you're interested in that kind of stuff. But it goes through like, here's how Black consumers, what kinds of things they like, how you should talk to them. So he's really doing the work to try to change that narrative. On one hand, he's successful because you get advertisements that are all of a sudden focused and aimed at Black consumers. On the other hand, the ads themselves end up shaping some of the derogatory narratives that we now associate with Black space. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, and that'll be the last thing I'll do. You'll see some of this here with the Smirnoff ad. Ebony Magazine, I looked through all of the issues that were published in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And I took a record of how many home goods were present, what types of advertisements. On average, I think the magazine was about 175 pages, long magazine. And about 75% were advertisements. So Ebony really is a vehicle for advertising. The majority of them end up being things like food, liquor, cigarettes, right? Which again, shape these narratives of Black people and consumers as being about, not make wise financial decisions, being about kind of the ephemeral things like partying and drinking and things like that. You do get a few home good things that pop up, and this is one of the only ads for home goods that had a Black family in it, right? So it's pretty exceptional in that for Bassett Furniture. But if you look closely, you'll notice in that top left-hand corner, this beautiful family is still in a high-rise apartment, right? Where you see the other very much are that family homeownership life. I compared Life magazine and Ebony magazine, and you had about 3 times as many ads for home goods in Life magazine. But the bigger difference is that I could count, maybe on 2 hands, the number of advertisements across those decades in Ebony that were actually about goods related to ownership. So normally there were things like furniture, small appliances like toasters, things that give the kind of feel of owning your space, but actually aren't tied to ownership itself. Where in Life, the majority of advertisements are for appliances, tile flooring, carpet, windows, things that are very clear that you see that consumer as the owner of their space. So again, part of what I want people to do is think critically about what narratives we create through things like advertising and what you start to see. The last thing I'll point out is that the majority of the ads, and I will share this with you, we're focused on things like food, clothes, cosmetics, and liquor. So Ebony Magazine, again, small magazine, focused on Black people exclusively, competing with hundreds of magazines across the country, was 5th in drug proprietaries, 8th in cigarettes in the nation, 10th in liquor, and 16th in cosmetics. So that should give you a sense of the kind of disparate proportion of those advertisements in Ebony magazines. And these are decisions that white businesses are saying, if I'm going to advertise to Black people, these are the kinds of things I think that they're going to be interested in. And I looked at some of the articles that were published among advertising magazines at the time and the conversations they're having about how to advertise and what to advertise to Black consumers. And these are the narratives that are kind of generated, right? These are just a couple examples that you can see for like the skin whitening creams. And what I found very fascinating, again, in Ebony is, as the magazine grows over the years, it's having these deep conversations like this one. This ad appears between the pages of this essay on the Black woman. It talks about her struggles, her achievements, and then you have an advertisement for skin whitening cream that says, this is how you are successful in the world. Similarly, you have this interesting advertisement literally on the same page as an essay that's talking about kind of white liberals and allyship and civil rights, and you have an advertisement for chemically straightening your hair. So part of what I'll wrap up and what I want people to think about is just how what starts off in these very local policies and grows to this national level is tied to bigger conversations about how we see ourselves belonging in this country and what behaviors we associate with different spaces and the people who live there. I'll end by saying that I wrote the conclusion of my book in the summer of 2020, which was a time to be writing this. But it allowed me to really think through, especially coming back to the Twin Cities after being gone for so long, how a lot of the issues that shaped, the murder of George Floyd aren't just explicitly about policing, but about the way someone like him was seen in that neighborhood and that part of the city, right? Because that wouldn't have happened necessarily in Edina, let's say, or somewhere else, right? And so I guess I hope you take away that there are very real tangible consequences to the narratives that continue to exist, and that you'll maybe think and kind of deconstruct as you look at, what you see on television. I think there's a new show by the guy who did The Wire, or what you hear on the radio, or what you see in an advertisement, because we continue to see the legacy of these policies today. So I'll stop there. One more.
So much. Any questions people have? Chris, actually, I'm gonna have you use the mic. Then people that are remote can hear as well.
I can use a big voice.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It was fascinating. And sorry I had to step out for a moment. You might have mentioned this, but there is a project at the University of Minnesota called Mapping Prejudice. Just Google Mapping Prejudice or Google Mapping Prejudice, and you can, if you're an owner of a property in the Twin Cities, you can have the property records checked at no cost to you legally. And if there is a covenant on your property, you can have it removed also at no cost.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mentioned that map came from them, but they'll even give you signs to put in your neighborhood. And so, because by a miracle, I was able to buy a house in Longfellow, and as I walk my dog every day, there's some of those signs up that have the, we had a racial covenant removed, or, so it's interesting to see that history, in these kind of like tangible ways in my neighborhood as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Yes, thank you for your talk, and very interesting. Couple things. One, I think because obviously when it is so subtle, it's hard for people to really get it, I think. And what's the other thing I was going to say?
Happens to me all the time. I'm like, what was that other thought?
Yeah. Oh, I know. So many things are tied to the tax base and home ownership. And you mentioned schools being one of them. And recently I talked to somebody who wasn't aware of that school funding is based on the tax base. Is that true all over? Do you know?
That's a really good question. So historically, that's true across the country, although we have dipped. So I say it's confusing because part of my job right now is I work in state policy around education. So I'm sitting in all the education hearings, and the head of the House Education Committee himself will admit there's probably 3 people in the state that understand our education formulas, and he's not one of them, and I am not fully either. It's part of it now, but we have very complicated formulas that shift around funding based off of what percentage of folks are on free lunch and others. So there have been efforts to, can you hear me okay with this? Okay. There have been efforts to fix that with some of our education formulas that attempt to reallocate funding to different districts based off of the socioeconomic makeup, which is a great way to kind of, I think, rectify some of these things. But again, you still have at the source of that tax base and just the general fact that education is deeply underfunded overall. So yeah, we're attempting to fix it, but our formulas are very, very, very complicated. So it's answer, non-answer.
Is this another way to keep that prejudice going, or that it's for segregation and yeah, downward push?
Yeah, I think, and I know you have a question after. I think even with the attempts that we've made, I mean, you can just see, and you can look at the schools that are closing in St. Paul and Minneapolis versus the schools in, St. Louis Park. And the thing that I think is interesting is what happens even outside of the public funding. So for charters, for example, or for public schools, this happened in Seattle a lot. What PTAs are able to raise for their school and supplement that funding means that a school in St. Louis Park is going to have radically different funding opportunities and things they can do than a school, like Central, right? So that's another piece of the conversation. There were some, before I moved back, some interesting moves to try to think, do we force people to, if they're going to raise that money, think through a portion of that being allocated because it still is a public school. But that's kind of a current debate about what to do with that. So it's definitely, well, people will say, well, we've done this to fix it, which is something I hear a lot in those hearings. The evidence speaks for itself because, I'm hearing from students who are testifying at Central who are sitting on the floor in a basement just to take an AP class, right? So clearly we have not fixed it, and that segregation is still happening. But yeah, great. And you had a question? Sorry.
Can you, and I haven't read your book yet.
Oh, that's so
maybe
fine.
the last chapter does this, but is there a way to change the narrative? We've had 2 or 3 generations to create this narrative. How do we go about fixing it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. That one comes up unsurprisingly at each talk, and I think I've gotten better at it, hopefully. It's complicated, right? I think that part of the narrative piece and the cultural piece are conversations like this because many people just aren't aware of the history. And I think for good reason. I love, even myself included, the conversations we have about this amongst people who are researching it and the conversations that are happening, in kind of the public discourse. There's often a gap there, and I think we're not doing a good job kind of facilitating those conversations. So I think learning about it is one, and then again, when you consume things, thinking critically about it so that people who are making films and making advertisements begin to change that, right? We have to get this into more places than just the small select folks that want to learn about history and teach it at a university. But then there's also concrete things. I am someone who believes that something that is economic has to be dealt that way as well, right? We can't fix this without economic change. And there are some tangible ways. When I bought my house, a lot of what I was thinking are just the disparate ways that someone like me who managed to, get a PhD, get a good paying job, barely was able to get a house. But part of that is I don't have access to that generational wealth. So when you have housing, people asking for an appraisal gap, for example, I can't cover a $50,000 appraisal gap because I have nowhere to borrow that from, right? Even if it's not going to actually be needed. Or, you know, some of these other parts like down payments affecting people's decisions. So I talk about this a lot with my friends of what would it look like for neighborhoods to say, if we really want our neighborhoods to be more integrated, especially I love my neighborhood, but Longfellow is still a very not integrated neighborhood. What would it look like to say, okay, yes, I'm committed to getting a good value for my home when I sell it because people can afford that, but maybe I will think differently about the offers I get to allow people who don't have access to that generational wealth for these other pieces to purchase this home, right? So I think that there are local things we can do as well, that people just have to start kind of in the same way that it started off in very local ways and people coming up with creative strategies. I think that the same things can help fix it, but we have to have those conversations first. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your passion, and also that, you know, these looking at policies, but also looking at the cultural piece of all of this. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was great. Thank you all.